I'm Jo Stanford. I'm just going to host this session and introduce our speaker in a moment. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Peter would really appreciate it if you'd have your cameras on and interact with him throughout this session, because it's going to be a great way to, find out more and talk to people and get involved. Now, I know there's some lurkers in there, so for those that have the confidence and willing to do it, please put your cameras on. That'd be fantastic. Doesn't matter if you're eating the lunch, it's a lunchtime session, and it's always nice to see what everybody else has got for lunch. Everybody else's lunch always looks nicer, doesn't it? The other thing is, what's really great about sessions like this is the opportunity to network and connect with your peers and counterparts. So if you can just take a moment and in the chat, write who you are, where you are, what you do, and it's great to see who else is on here so that you can spot people that you might be interested in connecting with. So do that. And if you're prepared to share your LinkedIn account as well, connect up with folks, that's also fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll get on with this session. We make the most of it, and I'd like to introduce Peter Lacey, who runs Whole Systems Partnerships. He's been working for many years in local government with the NHS and has a sort of a very brilliant engineering and systems dynamics and modelling background, and something that I want to learn more about. So I'm going to be joining in as well on this. And great to have you with us, Peter. But also for everybody here, this is a 2-session event. So if you haven't signed up for tomorrow's session, that one is a really counterpart to this one and works really well together. So if you haven't signed up for tomorrow's, we'll put the link in the chat. Please do, because it's going to really make a difference bringing that 2 sets of insights together. So over to you, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Just bringing up the slides, and you might think on first sight, sort of system dynamics modeling, that's lots of maths, isn't it? And then relationships, that's the soft stuff. I'll come to a little salutary tale at the end of this to demonstrate why it's important and what my journey has been over the 30 or so years that I've been doing consultancy. I am a bit of I suppose, a data geek. I'm not an analyst by training. I am a systems thinker that, as I emerged and got into the field, recognised that those were my skills. And thinking particularly in terms of a strategic consultancy type role, but recognising that you can't do the numbers and forget about the relationships. So that's just a little taster. This hour is about an introduction to systems thinking and modelling. I'm going to do 3 things, and I'm going to ask you to comment, put your hand up, engage. We'll move on fairly rapidly as necessary to keep it within the hour. But I want to talk a little bit about what is a system. Lots of definitions, ideas, thoughts. Sort of, is it intuitive, or is there a sort of technical textbook? I've got a version of that truth, if you like, that I will share with you that I found to be useful. Other brands are available. I then want to move into feedback and system behavior, because that's the nature of the system dynamics modeling, which I'll come on to in the 3rd part, and they'll all be just sort of skimming the surface, if you like, of 3 areas of interest that hopefully will be of use to you. So I'm going to start. What is a system? So this is my take. Well, it's not my take. I've put the reference in the bottom there. If you want a really good coffee table read about systems thinking, you can't do better than Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. Google it, you'll find it relatively easy. It's got a slinky on the front, I think, in terms of the version that I've seen. But this has been a sort of, I've taken this with me in terms of the conceptual thinking around systems, that a system consists of 3 things: stuff, connections, and common purpose. And I'll come back to those. We'll skim over them. I won't spend a lot of time here, but hopefully in the illustrations, you'll see how that can be helpful. Stuff, connections, and common purpose. If you go away with nothing else today, try and stick those in your brain. And when you see systems around you, circumstances around you, behaving in strange ways that you want to say, it's the system, stupid, then maybe this will be helpful. The dynamic nature of systems is reflected in the ability to capture 2 things: delays and feedback. We are well trained, particularly I think in project management environments, of thinking that everything is linear. We do X, we make sure it's done well, then we do Y, etc., etc. Systems thinking, and certainly the modelling that I'll share towards the end, is by its nature more, it's about complex behaviour emergence over time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've thought anything about complexity, the difference between complexity and complicated, won't go there at the moment, but some of you will be familiar with that sort of language. We're talking here about emergent behaviour of a system over time. So to illustrate that, and to not make it sort of over scientific or whatever, here's two examples. The first, everyday stuff, a sports team, whatever your sport, you can describe as a system. It has stuff because it has players. It has connections because there are rules and relationships and communication between those players, excuse me. And it has a purpose, to score goals, points, nets, whatever the sport is, it has a purpose. But experiences delays as players grow to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. You can't just put however many people in a team together and expect them to roll. You can't introduce a new player and expect them to instantly fit within the system. So there are delays and there's feedback. And I just used that little example there in terms of pursuit of excellence causes burnout. What then happens? You've got a sort of cyclical process. Boom and bust is something that I'll come back to in terms of system behavior. So we can think about a sports team as a system, and we can use that to diagnose the effectiveness of that sports team. Is it about we've got the wrong players? Is it because we're not communicating? Or is it actually that we've got the different purpose? Is my purpose of playing football on a Saturday afternoon, although I don't, to have fun, and I don't mind if I lose? Or am I devoted to winning and scoring more goals? And actually, if our purpose is different across the team, again, the system will not function as well as it could. In the healthcare context, there's the parallel, and I've just put it there. The health system, it has stuff, whether it's patients flowing through a system, workforce, beds, resources, money, etc. It has connections, whether they protocols, policies, relationships that you develop, and it has a common purpose. And what that common purpose can also be I suppose, a moot point in terms of how you see a system working. So hopefully we might come back to that in terms of the examples that we use. But I'd like you to think, hopefully that's already got you thinking. Somebody's put the Denial Meadows, thank you, Joe, in the link there. But I've given you two examples there. Think of your own, and there's always the chat there, so pop something in the chat. And I've given you another simple example there. From what I've said, is there something that suddenly jumped into your mind? Oh, okay, so I can think of X as a system. So Sunday evenings I sing in a choir. That's the system. The choir members are the stuff. And we are of varying quality. It's not a professional choir by any extent. And perhaps the conductor's baton is the main connecting thing within a choir to make the system work. We have fun sometimes in the band that I play in when we hand the baton to a member of the audience and they completely mess it up and we can't play properly. And there's common purpose. Well, in this case, it's having fun, not to win competitions. So if you've got any thoughts, pop that in the chat and we might come back to that in terms of what system you observe in your professional, personal life. The London Underground is a system. Yeah, stuff, quiet, the trains, the connections. Well, the map is a wonderful, iconic map, isn't it? Common purpose to get you from A to B as quickly and as efficiently as possible without too many bumps and scratches and everything else. So good example there. I like to think that simple sort of concept of a system will help diagnose a problem situation. So when systems go wrong, i.e. the intended outcomes are not being achieved, it's useful to reflect on the source of the problem using that system's lens. So think about London Underground. We've got the ICS there as well, and we're doing work with two ICSs at the moment, local authority across to health, and using some of our relational tools to think about how they might improve their performance. But there's when systems go wrong, you can normally identify some of the root causes in one or other of those elements: stuff, connections, or common purpose. I'm thinking back to the London Underground, or even to my choir example, when I've used the example of when the baton is in the wrong hands, the system starts to fall apart. So maybe there are ways in which you can use that simple three-element GP surgery as a system. Can you imagine using the London Underground without that iconic map? The system is my home. Parents, kids, connections, the car out, and the diaries, excellent. Staying positive, being happy and caring and having fun. Well, that's great. And I won't ask you to diagnose what's going wrong at the moment in your family, Lee, because that would be prying too much, but it's a good example. So supermarkets, yep. Some of the delivery mechanisms in terms of connections, common purpose. Well, I can tell you, the advertising of supermarkets normally give away what their primary goal is in terms of it's either price, quality, or a combination of the two. And clash of cultures, yeah, in a system, and that can often be about the common purpose. How are we seeking to achieve our goals? And that sort of creates a tension, and the system doesn't behave and deliver in the way that it can. We've got a banking system. Yeah, connections, payment networks, common purpose, storing and transferring value. We've got a little example. I don't think I've got it in here of the banking crash in terms of confidence in bank reserves and the run on the bank that happened in the late noughties, and how you conceptualize that as a feedback system. It's an interesting one for a training session. So if that sparks your interest, then we can talk further. So different ideas of direction of travel, or who the outcomes are for. Who are we running the London Underground for? Well, it's not shareholders now, is it? It's owned by the London, whatever it is, the mayoral authority. But you can ask the question. I mean, what about water companies? What's the purpose? Who is it owned for? Etc. I won't go there because we could get into politics. Systems in healthcare. I won't work through the words here. You've seen these common purpose stuff and connections. What I'd like you to focus on is the right-hand side, because this is part of understanding systems and potentially embedding and diagnosing, if you like, through the relationship between system structure and system behavior. You might expect your bit of the health system, whatever that is, to perform in a certain way, and you might expect your interventions, your projects, your interventions to achieve a certain goal. And that's the system behavior, if you like. We want our waiting lists to reduce. We have a waiting list initiative. We expect waiting lists to reduce as a result of our waiting list initiative. But you can often come across a situation where you scratch your head because you think, actually, shouldn't waiting lists be coming down faster because of my initiative? Why isn't it? And that's what starts to, that's your observation. Your system behavior, your expected behavior, and your observed behavior are different. And it creates the opportunity to think about which part of that system structure is actually causing that behavior, that unintended behavior. We've got something interesting in the chat there. The grammar of systems, that looks useful. Oh, yes, Patrick. I know Patrick very well, and can recommend anything that he writes. So, a colleague. So, systems in healthcare, the relationship, the important thing on this slide is the relationship between observed system behavior and then being able to go behind, if you like, that behavior to think about structure in terms of those three elements: common purpose, stuff, and connections. Just another way of getting into that systems thinking. So what are the tools of systems thinking? Just a couple of slides here, which are fairly standard in any of these systems thinking, certainly system dynamics related work. So the tools of systems thinking: dynamic thinking, positioning your issue as part of a pattern of behavior. We've just covered that. If that's the way that you think, then you're probably a systems thinker without even realizing it. You're trying to understand that behavior over time. System as cause, constructing a model, qualitative or quantitative, to explain how problem behavior arises. That can be just the sharing of a mental model. When you come up with an explanation, oh, I know why that's happening, X, Y, Z, you are describing a model, if you like, that gives an example and an explanation as to why that is, why whatever is happening, system as cause. Forest thinking, systems thinking, particularly the systems modeling that I'll share later on today, is about the big picture. Often use an analogy in the images of a helicopter and a microscope, and the fact that you do need to iterate, but if you don't go up in the helicopter often enough, then you get lost in the weeds. It's fairly familiar. You'll recognize the sort of the pull and the tension to be pulled into that minutiae. We'll only get it right when we understand every detail. Well, systems thinking of this brand is certainly about forest thinking, seeing the big picture. Then there's what one might call operational thinking, analyzing how things actually work. And there's an illustration later in terms of the analytics that we might deploy in terms of thinking about data and modeling. There's a seminal paper within the system dynamics modeling world called Modeling with Cows. And it's basically a paper that says that time after time, people have tried to analyze milk production using algorithms, using trends, using relationships within the data, etc., and none of them seem to work because none of them have a cow in the model. And operational thinking is recognizing that you need a cow to produce the milk, and therefore the cow's quality of grass and environment and health, etc., is all relevant to the production of milk. And it takes you out of that very detailed minutiae to think about how a system actually works on the ground. Second part of tools of system thinking, closed loop thinking, moving away from laundry lists. I've mentioned that already in terms of the sort of linear thinking that we often go through. And there are some examples in the middle part of this talk that give a few examples of that. Quantitative thinking, by which I mean, actually, even when there isn't data, we can quantify some of the softer elements and incorporate them and factor them into our thinking and our systems. A good way in terms of a human system, in terms of the adoption of change, the project is implemented, but we know that people take time to adapt and to learn new behaviors, processes, etc. And actually, if we don't do it right, the risk of reverting is relevant. So we can't just automatically think we've done the sums, we will implement the system, everybody will comply. Actually, we need to think about some of the quantitative implications of the softer variables, trust in the system, and the likes. So quantitative thinking, always trying to translate, not for anything other than trying to relate and the different components within a system. And scientific thinking, by which, and this is aligned very much to improvement methodologies, setting up a hypothesis, using the model to test your hypothesis and learning with the model. There's a well-known phrase within the systems modeling world that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And a phrase that we use quite a lot, which is being broadly right rather than precisely wrong, because you can guarantee that any modeling that you do will be precisely wrong, but can be broadly right and helpful. And if you wait for precision, you'll probably never take the opportunity to learn. And it's a bit like a helix in terms of starting on a cycle of learning and experimenting and using a modeling or a systems approach, and gradually sort of moving towards your goal, whilst the goal itself moves as well. So it is a dynamic process in itself. The characteristics of systems thinking. When we do our work, we ensure that this is not a black box or a an ivory tower exercise. I've mentioned the concept or the idea of mental models once already, but engagement is critical to understand how people's brains are working in the context of the issue you're trying to address. And if there are already hypotheses or explanations that are either spoken or unspoken, and this goes back to the scientific thinking, you're there to help people work out whether they are myths or truths, and the extent to which they can then be extracted and thought about. So combining knowledge from individual elements, aligning language, it's really helpful if you've ever done sort of exercises around flow charts, etc., for processes and pathways within health or care. Then actually being able to point to something on a piece of paper in an engagement process, which of course we've got less used to since COVID, is an invaluable approach. Second characteristic is to stick to the issue and not the data. We have a huge amount of data, an exponentially growing amount of data within the health and care system. But we've got to remember that that data is collected and gathered for certain purposes that may not match and meet the purpose and the issue that you're seeking to address. So we're a great fan of talking about a data-informed system or service, not a data-driven, because if you rely on the data collected for other purposes, then you'll often find gaps. So modeling the issue, not the data, understanding delays and feedback as fundamental contributors to system dynamics, which we've touched on already, and I'll touch on in the second section of this lunchtime seminar, and that it's a learning process. It is iterative, it is experimental, it's embedded within a strategic approach that reflects an improvement cycle, and you might call it action research. It's just a set of tools that help you on that journey. So those are that's the first chunk, if you like, in terms of what is a system. I can see no other comments or chats in the last few minutes, but I will pause very briefly to see whether there's any reflection or questions on what is a system.
So Peter, we only had one question, but it was about whether or not the presentation recordings would be available afterwards. Yep. And I've said, so yes, they will be.
Yeah.
And I don't know if folks are like me, where a lot of this is sort of fairly new to me, and I'm desperately concentrating and trying to learn and understand it as quick as I can. But if anybody does have any questions or comments, do you want to stick your hand up now? If not, you can add them to the Q&A and we will come back to them later. So no, we're all good for now? Okay.
Okay. So the feedback issue. We think in systems. Being conscious of the fact that systems are all around us. Hopefully you've recognized that in some of that first section. We've thought already about the structure and behavior of systems, observed behavior over time, informed by delays and feedback. That's fairly complex. The way of thinking is, however, completely natural to us, often subliminally, because we rely on cause and effect that is predictable, transparent, and self-evident. But what happens when things are a little more complex? So I've got an example here, which is probably 10 years or more old in terms of our work in strategic workforce planning. This was work that we did in however many iterations ago it was for Health Education England, which no longer exists anymore. In the world of local education and training boards, we did work across the whole of England, asking this sort of question. How do you decide how many training posts you create today for tomorrow's workforce requirements? And there is within this a sort of a story around what your policy in this context should be, using a model to understand and reflect on it, and actually then uncovering an archetype of system behavior. So I'll run through this one, and then there are two other archetypes that I'll share, and you'll get a sense. And I'm going to introduce, which is where the slides later, or some background reading if you're interested in doing, because I won't explain everything that's on the next slide. which looks like this. What I've got here is a causal loop diagram. Some of you might be familiar with it. If you've got a smiley face and you've encountered causal loop diagrams, press the smiley face, because there might be somebody out there for whom this isn't brand new. Yeah, we've got a thumbs up. That's good. A causal loop diagram is a way of explaining and exploring the causal relationships within a system. And what we've got here is that issue. How do we understand? How do we plan for the future workforce? You've got two elements and two what we call balancing loops. You've got a relationship between the number of medics in training, a gap in trainees, which is filled by new trainees recruited, which then completes the circle in terms of if you recruit more trainees, there are more medics in training. So that little circle on the bottom left-hand side has a delay in it, but it's a fairly sort of short-term delay in that you can adopt a policy of, well, when somebody completes training, we put somebody in the front end because we've got so many training places, a set number of training places, and that will satisfy that as a balancing loop. But if you then introduce and say, well, actually, we'd like our policy to be more informed by the future requirement for consultants, not the requirement to maintain a certain size of the education sector, you can see there a different purpose, if you like, for your modelling, then actually you've got a second loop. And that is that if you have medics in training become ultimately, with some leakage potentially and certainly delay, become consultants in post. And if you've got a target for consultants in post, then the relationship between the actual consultants and the target for consultants will create a gap, which then informs the new trainees recruited. So you've got there two systems, two loops, if you like, working together, both of them balancing loops, but having very different timescales. Even though a training program for a medic is a long training program, the lifetime of a consultant in the workforce is longer. And so that feedback and delay comes into effect. And what that produces, here is a model, it's over 10 years old, that represents, and it's a purely illustrative model. I've created a simple stock and flow, which I'll share in the third part of this session, where we've got 100 trainees and 200 consultants. That's the blue and the red line on there, and initially in equilibrium. But you then you jerk the system, you say to the system, well, actually, we'd like more consultants. And the response of the model is to say, okay, we want more consultants. That means we need to train more. Now, there are other routes into consultant workforce, like overseas recruitment, etc. But let's keep it simple. Your only lever that you can pull is to train more so that in the future you can have more consultants. So the blue line goes up in response to the requirement at some point in the future to have more consultants. But then when those consultants work through the system, then your requirement for training goes down, which then, and you can see the start of the story in terms of the feedback within the system, and you get that red line there, boom and bust, in terms of the number of consultants in post, which you could replicate in almost any professional group. And when we were doing this in the early noughties, the archetypal one was physiotherapists. It may be health visitors now. In terms of how you react in the here and now to a deficit, which then potentially overshoots and then creates that oscillation unless you understand and manage it. And the key thing here is that you don't have to live with this, but you have to understand it, because you can develop policies that will have a longer term time frame and will help you to address it. So this is a sort of hybrid between a causal loop diagram and the thinking of feedback and an archetype that is boom and bust, which can be extant in many different systems. A second out of three archetypes is what we call a fix that fails. I'm taking you outside the health sector here, but often ask people to think about how this might apply within the health system. If you take the top half of this, again, two balancing loops, but you've got a desired journey time. So your journey time, you're traveling to work, and your journey time is increasing. You're getting delays. There is therefore pressure to reduce congestion, which leads to potentially road construction, increased road capacity, and therefore reduced journey time. So you've got a balancing loop there that could solve your problem. However, and this time in a quicker time scale, if your journey time goes down, the attractiveness of driving, perhaps even further away for work or whatever, increases. And therefore journeys increase, your traffic volume increases, and therefore your journey time increases again. And what you've done is created additional road capacity, which only leads to more traffic, which then repeats the issue. It is a fix that fails. In the health sector, I sometimes think about waiting list initiatives in this way, because that's a potential risk. I mentioned waiting list initiatives earlier, that actually creating a waiting list initiative can cause behaviours elsewhere in the system that increase referrals, or people are referred to earlier, all sorts of small g gaming of the system that actually makes it difficult for you to achieve your goal. At the moment, I don't think that's the sole reason in terms of our waiting list challenge. But again, we could talk about that outside and conceptualize that system. So a fix that fails is a second archetype within the systems thinking world. I don't think I referenced here, but I think it's referenced somewhere, that the textbook on system archetypes is probably Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline, which again could be Googled easily. It's a longer tome, but it's also an excellent read, and it's now 20 years. I think there may be a new edition recently. The third, again, familiar, limits to growth, and this does have relevance in the healthcare sector. I was talking yesterday to folk about health promotion, and well, not so much health promotion, but weight management schemes and targeting different groups of people, and the fact that you've got potentially low-hanging fruit, that it seems very easy, and you extrapolate the success rate of an early scheme, and actually you realize actually over time you're becoming less and less effective because it's more and more difficult to reach certain people for those initiatives. On this example here, we've got a marketing production type process, and the key thing on the bottom there is that market saturation, if you've got a business that's growing topsy, but you don't factor in the fact that there is only a limited size of market, then you will reach that saturation level. So we've got the fifth discipline. Got a comment there about pilot training. George, what's your thoughts behind pilot training? I'm intrigued. Is George there? Does he want to speak?
He's put cyclical.
Yeah.
I don't know if you go on, George. Tell us what you think.
No, it's just what you're saying about the professions. Pilot training is another boom and bust one.
Okay. Yes.
So it was just a side comment as you were speaking.
Excellent.
And triggering my thoughts.
Yeah. So they're all around us, and this is sort of the sort of conversation. We've thought there about three archetypes that can help recognize and therefore respond to common day problems, and it links back to the first section that we were talking about in terms of observed behavior, and it is the structure underpinning a system that we can understand in terms of those three components: stuff, connections, and common purpose. How that is structured will be relevant in terms of understanding the behaviors. Boom and bust, fixes that fail, limits to growth. And we've had, so pilot training, George, you've anticipated my question. Pilot training is there. Anybody else got a system that they think mimics boom and bust? I saw some thumbs up when I mentioned waiting lists as a fix that fails. Not that we don't want to reduce waiting lists, but perhaps sometimes the way we go about them doesn't recognize some of the unintended consequences. Vaccination initiatives. Are we thinking there that could be a limit to growth? There's a sort of optimum level of vaccinations, or is it about something else?
I was thinking that you launch a vaccination initiative and it reduces the number of occurrences of what you're vaccinating against.
Yes,
So people
okay.
say there's no need, therefore they don't take
Yeah.
up the vaccinations, therefore it goes up again.
Yeah, no, that's a good example. Yeah. So I don't see any chickenpox around, so I'll not vaccinate my children, and then suddenly there's lots of chickenpox around. And the only reason why there wasn't was because everybody was being vaccinated. Good. Okay.
You get the same thing in project management, where when things are going wrong, they go, oh, we need more discipline and more project management governance in place. And then we get things into a better place. And then they go, oh, but it's all working fine now. We don't need this anymore. And so they stop doing it. And
Yep.
and then it sort of all goes to pot again.
Yep. Okay. So 2 sections there. What is a system? What are some of the behaviors in terms of archetypes that we can recognize and therefore sort of try and translate? System dynamics modeling, other varieties of systems thinking and system modeling are available, and we can talk about that separately. You can take a look at some of the literature, but I just came by happenstance. I became a system dynamics modeler in the early 90s. How's that? When there used to be regional health authorities, which look very much like integrated care systems do today. And I happened to be around when a project was being run. I received some training. System dynamics modeling is basically bathtubs, stocks and flows. And I'll show you in a moment how the stock and flow works for the model that we've just been thinking about in terms of forecasting or modeling future workforce requirements. So building models, we thought about system behavior. Can we then translate that into something that we can genuinely experiment with in the style that I mentioned at the end of the first section, in terms of what if questions, using a model to learn about what may well happen or to explain what is currently happening. So essentially, system dynamics modeling is bathtub modeling. You've got a little example down there. There's the wiring underneath, or the blue line is the software that we use. And it's possible there are 3 elements within system dynamics modeling. It's good. There were 3 definitions of a system, 3 building blocks of a system dynamics model: the stocks, the flows, and the converters and connectors. And in the context of, and again, we've got to build. Okay, we've got the build working now. It's probably my unfamiliarity with embedding my PowerPoint slides. So you'll recognize this picture from previously. I've now just put a box and an arrow around 3 elements, if you like: the consultants in post, the medics in training, and the new trainees recruited. That's to denote the fact that there's communication within that, which will be the converters and the connectors. I'll show you a little example in the next slide. But we're now translating our mental models and our system feedback causal loop diagrams into something that can be modelable. And to illustrate that, this is the simple stock flow model that generates the behavior that you've already seen in terms of that boom and bust cycle. And it's all dependent on the feedback and the sort of it's too fancy to call them algorithms, basically the sums within the model that generate that behavior over which you need to learn and seek to control. So structure in the stock flow creates behavior over time. And all we've got here is a flow of new recruits into medical trainees that take a certain amount of time to complete their training, become consultants, and then retire. It is a long time scale. In the model output there, you've got a 40-year time scale, which is always something that these models can be as long or short as is necessary to address the issue that we're exploring. And you can see there the connectors that are feeding back when we've got a target number of consultants. The calculations work in real model time, if you like, as the model runs to create that behavior. A bit now about what this means in terms of some of the, and I don't know all of your backgrounds, whether you've got an analytics background or whether you're part of an analytics team, attracted to the thought of having this introduction to systems modeling, which is deemed often as a sort of a data and analytical task. But if you're working with continuous flow of large aggregated numbers of things, then that's the context. And I've mentioned already not modeling the data, but not exploring the intrinsic characteristics of the data, but modeling a system that generates behaviors using that data. And I've put very big and bold there, data modeling does not equal system modeling, for effect, if you like, because you don't translate one into the other, you shape data. And if we've got time, I've got a very quick example later where I've taken some a system, the concept of a system, the design of a system, if you like, and then started to make assumptions that can then later be validated or explored or developed. But the important thing in this approach is that we first of all try and identify the issue, conceptualize the system, ensure that everybody's on the same page in terms of those with an interest in seeing the system improve, and then you start to gather the data to evidence rather than saying, here's the data, go away and tell us the answer. That is characterized by what's called the Gartner continuum of analytics. And you'll see very briefly there, I've got it in words on the next slide, how analytics falls within, and I'm sure there are sort of grey areas between descriptive, historic, what happened type of analysis. You might do some diagnostic analytics. Why did it happen? Are there correlations? Are there relationships? Predictive analytics, fine, what will happen, but that tends to be trend or regression analysis, etc. Or what's called prescriptive analytics. How can we make our desired future happen? And that is the environment. It's not that the others aren't helpful and useful in performing the latter, but what we're talking about here is a much more sophisticated use, I suppose, of our data and analytics to address issues where we want to improve performance. So simply, what has or is happening? Why did it happen? Will it happen in the same way in the future? But importantly, in terms of systems thinking and modeling, what should we do to respond to what could happen in the future? We don't want a boom and bust in our recruitment. If we model it and demonstrate that actually boom and bust is typical of our history, if you like, then we've got a model in which we can say we can anticipate it and we can change. We can almost behave counterintuitively in the here and now in order to get a more sustainable solution going forwards. So system dynamics modeling, you've seen what it is, bathtub modeling, stock flow, relatively straightforward, but embedded within that sort of learning developmental ethos. Useful for exploring feedback loops, validating mental models. Let's just test that out. Again, I've got that example later. Testing interventions, and it can address, at least help you to enter into areas where there are soft or qualitative problems within that modeling. It's not good enough to say there's no data on X or Y, therefore we can't model it. We can model an issue and understand its behavior and dynamics. Other modeling approaches are more suited towards discrete linear pathways or individual agent or capacity-based problems. And again, that's for separate reading. Patrick Hovestad, who mentioned earlier, would be a good person to speak to those. And in terms of the research, if you're thinking, oh, this looks interesting, then here's a little Professor Sally Brailsford, Southampton University, makes recommendations, if you like, as to when system dynamics modeling in the context of what we've described is useful. Strategic, large numbers, rates rather than queues, long time scales, although it can be shorter, and a key one there is to inform policy making. It is there to help you make decisions about how to implement a plan, how to indeed use a model to journey with you in implementing a plan. We embed that within a systems thinking learning approach. So this is about model building. Won't go into the detail, but model conceptualization, development, refinement, validation, and use. They're all fairly typical. It's just a borrowing of a sort of project management or implementation cycle. But the important thing here is that we're embedding a particular way of thinking and perceiving the world that enables us to progress and iterate the development process. So I've got a little case study that I can dip into, but that is a moment to reflect.
So there's a question, Peter,
Yep.
in the Q&A, and it's from George asking, what software packages do you use?
So we use Stella because it's what I started using 30 years ago. IC systems in the States. We are also working with some folk who are developing open source system dynamics modeling. They're available, they're a bit clunky, they're developmental, if you like, but there are certainly places within the NHS now who are using open source approaches to build simple models. As I said at the start, I'm not a programmer nor a modeler, and 30 years ago programming was something very different to what it is now anyway. So yeah, we use Stella, and that's the little illustration. Other to use simulator is a discrete event. I mentioned briefly without going into the detail. So it's more about discrete events rather than constant flows. But it does a similar thing, and simulator's been used in the health sector over the decades as well. It certainly does look at pathways. It just uses slightly different mathematics, if you like, as to when and how decisions are made, and is less about feedback and delays, which is the characteristics of system dynamics. So, and Vensim is nice but expensive, I think. Well, it might have changed, but Vensim is system dynamics. Yes, Elise. So if you've got the license, then that's okay.
If people use other things, do you want to share what you use locally? I've put it in the chat, and whether you think it's good, bad, or indifferent. So now's a chance to ask Peter any questions that you've got. I'm hoping that some of you know more about this than I do, and because this really was a very basic introduction for me, this is very new to me, and a lot, I think, of really valuable stuff to learn here. But some of you might be more experienced and have some more insights about how things are working or not working in this area, and what would you like to see in the NHS. Stick your hand up if you do some kind of systems thinking or modelling or something like workforce planning. Stick your hand up so we can see who's sort of working in this area.
Elise.
Yes.
Elise, great.
Elise, and Elise has just finished her level 7 systems thinking apprenticeship,
right,
and very successfully as well. So congratulations to Elise. That's brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Also the only person who's currently finished the apprenticeship.
That is an achievement. Well done, you.
Well, I contribute to that, to a level 7 apprentice program. So yes, there's a link there to Stella Online. I've got a brief case study and then a salutary tale that links into tomorrow's session. So while people are thinking that there may be other questions, I will run through the brief case study and tell you the salutary tale. Who's been piece in the news recently about donanemab? It was in the news last year, and it's just coming up again. And I think I saw a piece in the Guardian recently that gives away my reading preferences, where donanemab, which is a drug that has is evidence to slow down the progression of dementia, is about to be licensed. The story in the Guardian was about, well, that's okay. So it's a good story in terms of systems thinking, because they suggest that in order to get donanemab, which is proven to be effective in slowing down the progression of dementia, you have to have a scan. and the number of scans that would be required greatly outwits our current capacity to provide that. And then it provides some international comparisons in terms of the number of PET scans or MRI scans, whichever is needed to diagnose it. So it's a good example in terms of the media of people picking out a reason why this might not work. However, I sat down when the evidence first came out about 6 months ago and asked myself what would happen. So donanemab was heralded. There's a little press release there from Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, who provided a piece of data, i.e. a piece of intelligence, very small there, but nearly half, 47% of participants on donanemab compared to 29% on placebo had no clinical progression at 1 year after taking the drug. That's a goldmine piece of intelligence, and it's actually virtually all I needed to be able to say, what happens? What if? And what would be the impact on the prevalence of dementia were donanemab to be spread widely? So it's suitable for this sort of thing, and it was very sort of straightforward. I spent an hour or so building myself that stock flow. MCI is mild cognitive impairment, mild dementia, and then late stage dementia. The claim of donanemab was that if you had been diagnosed and recognized as having mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, you could be given donanemab and it would slow down your progression from left to right. Now, I wonder whether anybody can intuitively suggest what would happen to the overall prevalence of dementia were that to be the case. Would it go up, down, or stay the same? I should have a little poll. If you don't put it in the chat, make a mental note. This is a good thing. It slows the progression. We made some assumptions. These will come round, so I won't read through these, but we just had to make some assumptions. So we've got an up, we've got a same, we've got another up, we got up, up, and same. So the poll is sort of generally in the right direction, that it will go up. Some people are thinking it'll stay the same. This is the proof of the pudding. So there's the model on the left-hand side. I made all the assumptions that were informed in assumptions. They weren't totally guesstimates, and they used the evidence from the trial. So that golden nugget of what impact would this have? I've made assumptions about it wouldn't get to everybody, it would take time to deliver, etc. So I factored in some of the delays. And the lines that you can see on the graph there, after an initial period of 3 or 4 years of stable, 100 people in each of the 3 stocks, basically, you then interject with the, and it's a percentage change, sorry. So 100 is the unit. And then what you've got is 4 lines. The blue line is the total, sorry, the blue line is the percentage change in mild cognitive impairment. The change in early stage is the red dotted line. So actually what you are doing is, because you're slowing down the progression, you are increasing by 20%, all other things being equal, the number of people with early stage dementia. Now that's a good thing, because in the short term, you're in effect slowing down their progression to further advanced dementia. But you will see that after, 15 years, which is within the life cycle of sort of long-term strategic planning, then actually the change in the number of people with late-stage prevalence will return to the previous levels, because what you're doing is you're not changing the number of people you're not stopping people getting dementia. All you're doing is redistributing and lengthening the total period over which that dementia will be experienced, and therefore the introduction of donanemab potentially increases the demand for other services, not only scans, but also support and care and other factors related to dementia care and support. So that was me saying, I'm a systems thinker. I've got this modeling tool. I've got something that's been thrown at me from the media. It's a marvelous thing. What will it mean in terms of planning? And we therefore gained insight. We see a 10% reduction over 3 to 5 years, short-term gain, but it returns to previous levels with basically more people in the population with a diagnosed dementia. and you can see the politics and the policies and the finance and the resources that would flow.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Peter. I think that really brought that to life in a quite disturbing way, because the impact of something that on one hand seems good, but then how that would sort of impact the system overall is fascinating. I'm just mindful of the time. We've only got a couple of minutes left. We don't have any more questions, I think, in the Q&A. We've had some sort of general comments from people, but I just wanted to say that was a really fascinating insight and a great session. And for somebody who knew nothing about it, a really engaging introduction for me, and I'm desperate to learn more about it now, because I think there's so much power behind some of this, but also to help us that are managing changes within the healthcare sector understand the systemic impact of the changes that we're making, and how we can manage and mitigate some of that stuff. So for those of you that are interested in learning more, Peter's given some examples of where you can look up some more specific things, but also we've got the session tomorrow, and as I said, that dovetails with this session. You'll learn more about how you can work with people in relation to some of the systems thinking thing, if I understand it correctly. I'm going to be joining remotely, so Steph's going to be hosting tomorrow, but that was a really great start. Thank you so much, Peter.
So
and
my very brief 30-second salutary tale.
Go for it.
Was that we did a marvelous piece, as you would expect, of quantitative systems modelling about 15 years ago in an area around community hospitals. And I can remember saying to a colleague, as we completed and handed over this top-notch quality report as to what they should do, that they don't stand a chance of implementing it, because they were all at each other's throats. And 6 years later, I got a phone call from somebody who had worked with elsewhere, who had turned up in this system, and gave me a ring and said, Peter, I think we've got a bit of a problem on our community hospitals. Can you come and do some modelling? And I said, let me describe your problem. Is it exactly the same as it was 6 years ago? Yes, it was. So yeah, relational thinking tomorrow, and hope you can join us.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you, and really important, because ignore the people side of change at your peril.